Well, good morning. I think we'll go on ahead. Welcome to the fourth annual Department of Pediatrics Research and Scholarship Day, a day in which we celebrate the scholarly endeavors of our students, residency, and faculty this past year. But before I introduce today's speaker, I'm going to ask Dr. Maher, our Associate Chair, to come up and do his first part of the program. George.
Each year, a panel of faculty in pediatrics is appointed to evaluate the performance of medical students rotating through pediatrics. This year's committee consisted of Dr. Schimmelpfennig from Sioux Falls, Dr. Willman from the Yankton campus, and Dr. Cooler from Rapid City. After considering narrative commentary and testing, the award for excellence in pediatrics this year goes to Cassidy Boyd from our Yankton campus. Dr. Boyd already received a monetary award at a dinner held in her honor in Yankton, lest you think we're holding out on her. But we thought it would be more appropriate to present the actual award here at Research and Scholarship Day. Please join me in congratulating Cassidy Boyd.
My computer's dead, so I didn't bring it down here, so I will be actually able to pay attention completely.
Smile.
Okay. What happened? There.
Well, thanks, George. So, to celebrate today's event, we have invited Dr. Hugh Allen, a prominent expert in pediatric cardiology, to present today's grand rounds. I have to say, I first met Dr. Allen several years ago when he accepted the position of deputy editor of the journal Pediatrics in Review. What began with an acceptance phone call quickly became a collaboration, a partnership, and a strong friendship that over the years has resulted in actually a very successful CME journal. So, what is his career? Well, he began his medical training at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine in Cincinnati, Ohio. After graduating medical school, Dr. Allen completed his rotating internship at Hennepin County General Hospital in Minneapolis, and that was followed by a pediatrics residency and fellowship in pediatric cardiology at the University of Minnesota. And somewhere in there, he did a brief stint as major in the United States Army Medical Corps in Fort Hood, Texas. Upon graduation from his fellowship, Dr. Allen began his academic career by first joining the faculty at the University of Arizona as an assistant professor, and surprisingly, in 3 years, he became an associate professor, so I'm impressed. After a brief sabbatical as visiting associate professor in UC Davis, Dr. Allen returned to University of Arizona, where he quickly was promoted to full professor with tenure at the University of Arizona. Again, quite impressive. However, Arizona could not hold him. He then switched over to the Departments of Pediatrics and Internal Medicine at the Ohio State University College of Medicine in 1988, where over the following years he served as chief of the section of cardiology, vice chair of academic affairs at Nationwide Children's Hospital. In 2012, Dr. Allen and his wife Liz happily returned to Texas, this time Houston, where he joined the faculty at Baylor College of Medicine, and he now serves as professor of pediatrics and staff cardiologist at Texas Children's Hospital. Actually, Dr. Allen's academic achievements are quite a legend. He has over 30 research grants, has received many, many teaching awards, has authored many peer-reviewed publications, has reviewed even more manuscripts for multiple journals. He has served on over 30 editorial boards. He's been a residency director. He's been a fellowship director. He has mentored hundreds, if not thousands, of medical students, residents, and fellows, has chaired and served on a myriad of hospital and medical school committees, and is a member of over 20 medical professional societies. Well, I can continue by talking about how he is the yin to my yang. He is the bad cop to my good. He is the cheese to my macaroni. But I invite Dr. William Waltz to come up to conclude the introduction.
Oh, my God. We didn't tell you about this part, did we, sir? I was one of Dr. Allen's fellows at the Ohio State University, but I'll still be brief. Probably working with Dr. Allen is best exemplified by a particular situation. I had the joy and privilege of doing a lot of outreach clinics with him, and on one of them, we drove down through the small town of Waldo, Ohio. So I made an offhand comment as we drove through the city limits. I said, well, there's Waldo. And on the way out of town, I made the mistake of saying, I wonder who Waldo is. So after a full outreach clinic, we came back and we spent the next hour traversing the town of Waldo, from the city hall to the fire department to bars to someplace I think we might have almost got shot. But that really exemplifies Dr. Allen. It's so critical that we as physicians, researchers, that we ask the question and not only do it, and let it stick with us and say we have to answer this question and figure out how to answer that question, even if it almost gets us shot. But that has carried Dr. Allen through so much. I mean, if you were to print off his CV, you'd have to clear cut an old growth forest, which would make the big guy upset. So that feeds into a career with this and the teaching of the residents, students, fellows, faculty that Dr. Allen has spread out, and his effect on medicine, on clinical medicine and research will never fully be realized. But it's with respect I introduce Dr. Allen.
I want you to believe about a third of what was said. I've been asked today to discuss cardiomyopathy. The emphasis is, since this is a research conference, is on development of research, how you can do it, and you really can do it. That's been proven over here. Congratulations. So I'm using, as requested, my own career as a template for this. So please don't think that this is a self-aggrandizing kind of a thing. It's what I was asked to do. So we're going to talk about the skeleton that we're going to hang the meat on is Duchenne cardiomyopathy. So I got nothing to disclose. It's all been presented here. I do want to comment that there are many, many people at this wonderful institution whom I have professionally encountered through the past. Gene Hoyme had a mustache and was young. This is Vince Fulginetti. These are various members of our faculty that showed up for the picture. I didn't. There's Willie with his favorite plaything. Larry Fenton. Larry and I were freshman classmates in medical school. Larry's wife, Gail, was the biochemistry secretary that all the med students were hitting on, but Larry succeeded. Now, how long have you been married now? 53, 54? 52. Early. Other colleagues that I've encountered on the way, and I'm sure I'm going to leave someone out, but Dave Munson, when I was a chief fellow in cardiology, was considering a cardiology fellowship. Tripp made a mistake and went the other way. Then at Nationwide Children's, and these are whom I could figure out from your faculty profile, people that I've run into, Rebecca Bakke, Elizabeth Bauer. Copperroot, there's a whole story there. Joe Sedulon, again, made the mistake of going into intensive care. And Dr. Zylstra, who will tell horror stories about encounters. So the goal of the talk is to catch us up and learn a bit about Duchenne cardiomyopathy. We're going to talk about various types of research that are sort of striated from case reports up to prospective studies. By learning from history, hopefully you won't repeat it. And we're going to talk about academic misconduct, how you keep yourself out of very, very hot water. And know that the bottom line here is y'all can do research, and you should. And you can do it as a resident, and I'll show you some of the stuff that happened along my path. So again, hopefully not self-aggrandizing, we're going to talk about the evolution of my own research pathway. Then, from my experience in pediatrics and review with our fantastic editor, Joe, and the Ohio State University's research, I chaired the Research Misconduct Investigation Committee for the university, and that was its own experience. We only fired 4 professors. And then how some great people, and really great people, have had their careers destroyed through trusting underlings and not watching what they were doing. Well, case reports. Now, this is the weakest form of research, but it can be productive. It's often anecdotal, and avoid that. Some case reports do open future population studies or basic studies. A unique observation then can serve as sort of the bottom of an upside-down pyramid that allows development of ways to look into basic concepts. Don't rediscover the wheel. Look stuff up before you report something. Usually, I've heard the phrase scooped again by Pasteur, that somebody has already done it. And a lot of journals will not accept case reports now. A good way around it is Peds in Review. We've got a visual diagnosis section. We've got interesting observation type section. So you can get a good case report into that, and I would recommend doing so. Okay, my first paper. This is Bob Good. Born in Crosby, Minnesota, raised there. In med school, developed some sort of a viral disease that resulted in his being wheelchair dependent. Actually, his mother pushed his wheelchair through his graduation. It was polio. He had a permanent foot drop. Bob wore high-top tennis shoes to help brace his ankle up. And when he would get fellows from across the pond, they would try to emulate. So the first thing they did was buy high-top tennis shoes, not really. Bob described immunodeficiency. A lot, again, following Dr. Bruton, Colonel Bruton at Walter Reed, where the hypogammaglobulinemic patient was described. That one was after a measles attack, but then Bob found it in the SCID, severe combined immunodeficiency. He also described tonsils as a immunologic organ. He described T cells from the thymus, and along with Papelbon, he found the bursa in the chicken, source of B cells that we create through our intestinal lymphatics. So he's really the father of immunology. This was my first paper. A kid came in from Connecticut in the middle of the night. I was a resident. He was covered with staph abscesses. He was about 15, 16 months old, failure to thrive. Had several relatives who had died of severe combined immunodeficiency disease. And Bob was ready through his basic studies to do a clinical study. And based upon these experiments in nature, we did the world's first bone marrow transplant. It's published in Lancet in 1968. And I was the third author on that paper. So that was a cool way to start. I should have stopped at that point. Other case reports that I've been involved with that are first observations, there are about 5 of us in the country that started pediatric echo, and I was at the U of M at the time. I was telling Joe this morning that there was an echo machine in radiology that was dusty, and somehow at midnight it showed up in pediatric cardiology. And I basically played around with it for 3 months until I figured out how to use it. We had child come in. I remember his name, but for disclosure won't state it. With cyanosis, left axis deviation, Wolff, Parkinson, White, classic presentation for tricuspid valve atresia. Problem was, it did the echo, and I found this big glob in the right ventricle. It was a rhabdomyoma. Well, nobody believed it because that goes, no, we need EKG and X-ray. They showed okay. So they did a cath. And as the catheter got into the right ventricle, it wasn't tricuspid atresia anymore. So to explore, they shot an angiogram, which provided us with the specimen because it blew the right ventricular wall off, in that the tumor held the catheter here and the anterior wall took the hit from the injection. And it proved, so we have echo path correlation, and that was a case report. So it's the first description of a tumor by echo. Another observation, a visiting fellow that I had from Israel, Teddy Hagesh, we had a child in whom we had closed a ventricular septal defect operatively. And he came in with this loud ejection murmur, did the echo, and he had a subaortic membrane, and described the mechanism of subaortic membrane development as related to the aneurysmal tissue under the, or when a VSD is spontaneously resolving. Later with Phil Thrush, who is now on faculty at Rush, at Northwestern, the Children's Hospital, Lurie Children's, and is a specialist in cardiomyopathy. We had this guy with Duchenne come in with chest pain. Well, they don't get chest pain. He had an elevated troponin. They don't get elevated troponin. It was cardiomyopathy with superimposed myocarditis, and indeed find out that the dystrophin gene is particularly susceptible to enteroviral infection. And now, since I've been in Texas, we've had 4 more, 3 times in the same kid. So this description opened up the observation that these guys are particularly susceptible to myocarditis. Now, to give you a little background on Duchenne, this is Guillaume Duchenne, who was born in 1806 in Boulogne. Dad wanted him to be a fisherman, but he said no. Dad was unhappy about this. He was mainly a neurophysiologist. He pioneered if any of you have ever had that electromyogram where they stimulate and make your muscles twitch and see the speed of the nerve conduction. Hurts like hell, but he pioneered that. He also pioneered muscle biopsy, was a great observer, and to his credit, he didn't get along well with superiors. He plowed his own furrows. Others fertilized him. In 1861, he presented a child in a textbook that he was writing who was non-ambulatory and had calf hypertrophy. That was a Duchenne patient. Well, he got his name. In 1862, he used a new tool that was just out called photography. Took pictures of these guys, put the illustrations into a journal, and then in 1868, he described 13 more boys, which got his name attached to this particular disease process. It affects 1 in 5,000 boys. You all are familiar with this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but by about 2 years, they're stumbling. They often, when they fall, will splatter their nose or get a laceration. They can't hold themselves up. Their muscles in their arms don't stop the fall. The Gower sign, which you're all familiar with, they generally have hypertrophic calves. Usually what happens is about 5 years or so before school, somebody will observe these kids are really clumsy. A physical therapist often makes a diagnosis, sends them to a neurologist, the CK is obtained, and it's elevated. Now we have genetic testing that localizes the problem, the genetic location. Around 12 years of age or so, they become wheelchair dependent. And it's often very abrupt. If they happen to have fallen and broken a leg, they'll never get back out of the wheelchair. Other times they just, one day, it's time for the wheelchair. They die in the 3rd decade. It had been in the 2nd decade, but pulmonologists have become so good at BiPAP and keeping their airways open, understand their intercostal muscles and diaphragm go. So they need to be expanded, particularly at night. And that pulmonary care has given them another decade. Now it's our turn in cardiology, and they're dying mainly of ventricular tachydysrhythmias, as well as their cardiomyopathy. This disease will never go away. It affects a bunch of boys, so finding a cure has been a lifetime study by Jerry Mendel, and we'll get into what happened. Pathogenesis, in '87, they cloned the gene. And this opened up new avenues for potential treatment. It's 2.6 million base pairs long. It's the largest gene in the human genome. And a critical obstacle for molecular manipulation is the size of the gene. What are you going to manipulate? Well, here you've got hinges. You've got 4 hinges. You've got a bunch of spectrin repeats. You've got a C terminus and an N terminus. This is very cysteine rich. All this amounts to different areas with different problems. Dystrophin here, this is the cell wall. It can be thought of as a girder that holds the bridge of the cell wall up. And if the girder's not there, the wall's going to fall. Now, to make dystrophin, you've got exons and introns. That's any gene. They then get together and make a messenger RNA that allows dystrophin to be developed. If we are missing an exon, and this is 80% of Duchenne boys, what happens is these two can't get together. It's out of frame. And what therefore happens is no dystrophin is created. And these boys are dystrophin-less. So the consequence is basically all these cell walls summate into a fibril, myofibril, into a muscle, and progressively scar, and you end up with that muscle being lost. Here is the production of the dystrophin in the cell wall. This is a boy with Duchenne, and it's missing. So this is what's looked for in the muscle biopsy. Now the heart, what Dr. Waltz is interested in, progressively scars. And it's not related to skeletal muscle changes. You can have cardiomyopathy and be walking around, or you can have a 23-year-old without cardiomyopathy who's been wheelchair dependent for a decade. So it's a separate timing type process. Starts in the posterior wall of the left ventricle. Think of the left ventricle as a strawberry. Up by the stem, back here where the mitral valve is hinged, is where the process starts. And it's an outside to inside cellular destruction process that proceeds down toward the apex. The wall stiffens. It's not necessarily a dilated cardiomyopathy in that it's partially restricted because scars don't stretch. Ultimately, there's left ventricular systolic dysfunction as well as diastolic dysfunction, which we're just beginning to understand. The other is, for whatever reason, and I haven't the foggiest, they develop disordered automaticity with an average heart rate that is rapid, and there's almost no diurnal variation. There's no circadian rhythm to it. So the fundamental questions, as I have gone through, is what happens to the heart in Duchenne? When does it happen? How should the heart be evaluated? Should they be treated? After all, they got a fatal disease. Why should they be treated? What with and when? So to diagnose cardiomyopathy, electrocardiography had been the key. Now, we get into retrospective studies. We've gone from case reports, now we're retrospective studies. They can give new insights. Often they're experiential. There are so many surgical report cards out. I did 45 cases of this way, and I got the best results ever, the Trump approach. And it doesn't mean it's the correct approach. It can amount to a report card, and not everybody gets straight A's. It can take a huge amount of time. My first one was a year and a half of reviewing 341 patients who had VSD surgery at the University of Minnesota from 1954 to 1961. And it took forever to get through those charts. For one thing, the surgeons never wrote notes. You'd have to rely on anesthesia even to know if the kid survived, because the anesthesia note would stop. It I had stacks of charts next to my desk, read every one of them. In retrospect, it was a waste of time. They often don't represent consistency. There are a lot of missing data. Now, the EKG in Duchenne. Perloff studied 20 patients and came up with about 400 conclusions. He found these characteristic changes of Q waves. And then another study of Moore that was also retrospective, again, emphasized the Q waves. And they also said that there was RVH, right ventricular hypertrophy, that was progressive, but it was not a serial study. And the more RVH, the less left ventricular wall you had. That was the teleologic approach. So therefore, these were called a marker for cardiomyopathy and time to initiate treatment. Here's the EKG. This is an EKG for the residents of the PR interval is shortened, and we find that in half the patients. They have right ventricular hypertrophy here, and that's in about a third of the patients. And they have Q waves, in this case, in 1 and L, V5 and V6. Usually they're 2, 3 AVF, V5 and V6, and about 10%. Now, I just gave you the results of our study, but we looked at 115 boys. I kept a database on every Duchenne kid I had with IRB approval and was consistent in the way I saw them in the clinic, EKG and echo. So we had information on 115 boys. Phil Thrush did this study with us. 40 had cardiomyopathy, and that's the usual breakdown, about half. And we defined cardiomyopathy arbitrarily, and others agree, as an ejection fraction less than 55%. Mean age of cardiomyopathy was 15.3 years in these guys. And their mean ejection fraction was 42%. You want 55. 75 were normal, they were 10, and their EF was 60%. Now what we found was half had a short PR. Third had RVH. Nobody, as advertised in other studies, had a prolonged QT. Q waves were most often in the lateral leads, V5 and V6. But when you looked at 1 and L, that was described as the most common, it was only in 3%. So the study of 20 patients happened to have a majority with this, but they'd done a bigger study, it'd be 3%. 2, 3 AVF, V5 around 8%, 10%. So concluded, there was no difference in these findings. It's basically a Rorschach thumbprint test. This, you show me that EKG, I'll tell you the kid's got Duchenne, but I won't tell you how bad he is. So there's no difference in Duchenne with or without cardiomyopathy. Most common finding, short PR and RVH, yada, yada, yada. So these should not serve as a basis for treatment decisions, was our conclusion. Now this is a retrospective study. We did have a database that was prospectively acquired, but the data were reviewed. This was a cross-sectional, not a serial study, but it was large enough statistically to allow conclusions, and it led to a further study. And that was, does the R wave progression and the V6 R wave regression correlate with the cardiomyopathy? So we had a medical student, Dr. Edward now, look at 154 boys who had 805 EKGs. And they were electronically measured for the RVH. Then we discovered that Wayne Franklin had malprogrammed our EKG machine, and we reprogrammed it when our new electrician got there. And Dr. Edward went back and redid all 805 EKGs. It took him a summer, but we do have serial information. And we found no correlation between RVH with the left ventricular dimension, E-point septal separation, which is going with dilation, shortening fraction or ejection fraction, and there was no serial progression with time. So it debunkified the previous conclusion that's in the textbooks all over the place, based on 20 patients. Disordered automaticity. These guys have the resting tach. I told you about that. Heart rate is age dependent, so we start screening. If an adolescent has an average heart rate over 100, generally after they pube, that's when they have disordered automaticity. Before adolescence, it's normal, so don't pay any attention to it. This could be a decrease in parasympathetic activity or increased sympathetic tone, or both. They lack circadian rhythm, and the study by Kirschman showed that half these guys had decreased variability. That's not our study. Arrhythmias in Duchenne. These guys can have disorder of the sinus node due to scarring. Ectopic atrial tachycardia is rare. SVT, anybody can have SVT, so they might be in the antibody category, or it could be their problem. Atrial fibrillation. Now we get into the business. VT, that's what they die of, is ventricular tachycardia going to fibrillation. And that's probably related to the scarring. Typically seen in the older Duchenne patients. They'll show you PVCs that are multifocal early on. And should we consider a defibrillator as a therapeutic option? But they have a fatal disease. Now you get into the whole ethics. We had a med student review all of our experience at Texas Children's, and this retrospective study showed that the guys did have, with aging, increased ventricular tachydysrhythmias, and it really starts in the early teen years. So now we routinely, based on this, get Holters on all teens at least annually. Okay, good. Echo. This has been our main tool. We look for how big the ventricle is, how well it squeezes, and we can also look at how well it relaxes using wall stress. Now, since we're talking about my career development, we go back, we started studying this in the mid to late 70s. And Stan Goldberg, my chief at Arizona, was big on this. So started out M mode. We used a computer and saw how fast the rise and fall of the systolic contraction was. And these guys had delayed relaxation. Then we looked at serial wall measurements and saw that they thinned, particularly in the area where the scarring takes place. And then we did finally a two-dimensional echo once we had two-dimensional echo and looked at the population again. So those are the early papers that I was involved with. The cardiomyopathy in Duchenne, here's a normal. This could be Bill Waltz after a day with his shotgun. You see how well the septum, the posterior wall are squeezing together. The apex would be down here. Here's the mitral valve, aortic valve. Now this guy with Duchenne, somebody took an ice cream scoop and hacked out his posterior wall behind the mitral leaflet. That's where the scarring initially takes place. And look how sluggish it is. It doesn't do anything. So this guy would have an EF somewhere in the high 30s, low 40s. I don't think this will work. This is just the apex view that we use to measure cardiac output or shortening fraction, ejection fraction. This is mitral valve regurgitation. As the ventricle dilates, the leaflets pull apart and it becomes a sound of one hand clapping. See, you end up with regurg. Ejection fraction is simple. If we squeeze this room, we have a population of 100 students and people in here, and 50 leave, we have 50 over 100. That's an ejection fraction of 50%. That's essentially what we do when we measure these. And presently, it's a gold standard of function. Here's how we trace in diastole and systole. This is that same guy we showed earlier, and he had 41%. Okay, treatment. Now, we could go into a whole 2-hour lecture here, but DIG is out. It's arrhythmogenic. It doesn't do that much. Following the adults who have taken patients with heart failure who had a 5-year death sentence when they are told they have heart failure and got them off transplant list, got them back to work. Angiotensin-converting enzymes have been a lifesaver, so we applied it to this group. Beta blockers, a lot are on. Diuretics you use at end-stage aldactone, milrinone for an acute problem. How about ICD? How about destination therapy? Becker patients get transplanted. They make a little bit of dystrophin. Hold that argument. Now, our database now is 1,338 echoes going back to the database we had at Nationwide Children's. We wanted to look at the natural course of left ventricular function to development of cardiomyopathy. How long does that take? What age do they have cardiomyopathy? Response to treatment using either an ACE inhibitor or plus or minus a beta blocker. We initiated standard ACE inhibitors if the EF was less than 55%. We initiated lisinopril at 0.07 milligrams per kilo, rounding out to 2.5 or 5 milligrams. And we would kick the dose upward if there was at least 5% downward spiral. I used a beta blocker for the disordered automaticity. So some will use it for increased function, but I was using it for that. But we looked at the impact of that. So we had 65 boys who had true cardiomyopathy. We excluded 20 of them, 45 with or without pre-therapy echo data, and 25 got an inhibitor only, 32 only. The others were combined with a beta blocker. Here's the natural history. As we followed these guys serially, the downward trend occurred over about 4 years. The youngest cardiomyopathy diagnosis was 7 years. I now have a 5-year-old and 4 7-year-olds. The oldest was 27 years until he developed his. The mean was 15 years. And that's pretty much everybody that's looked at this gets the same thing. Here is the response to treatment. Here's the natural history. And here you can see that an ACE alone or an ACE plus a beta blocker improves the function. Now, what we don't have are serial data that shows that this deteriorates as they continue to worsen. When we looked at ACE alone or ACE with a beta blocker, no difference. So the beta blocker did not help. Conclusions, they all deteriorated. Treatment resulted in improvement. There was no difference between the two groups, and there is ultimate progression to dysfunction in spite of treatment. Phil Thrush and Laurence Violet, who is now over in Belgium. A prospective study. Now, this is the way, if you can, do it. It's hypothesis-driven. Methods are developed. You think about it in advance of the study. How am I going to evaluate this hypothesis? I think that all fruit trees are green. I've got to study at least 200 fruit trees to prove that they're green. But then along comes winter, and that'll mess up your data. So you think about your hypothesis. You think about all the wheres and why-fors. Then you have to have adequate numbers to pass a statistical muster. And usually you compare a intervention group versus a control group. And best if you don't know who's getting what. A placebo arm is best if possible. Now, some situations don't allow that. Safety has to be assured. And in clinical trials, usually a phase 1 is very limited numbers. You see if it works, and you see if there's a disaster resulting. Phase 2 is a larger population, and there you start looking for subtleties. And then phase 3, a very large population, precedes approval by the FDA. This can be a 25-year process. This is a multi-center site that I study that I set up. Boston, St. Louis, Nationwide, U of M, and UC Davis. And we were looking first at how good are the echo measurements? Are they valid? Since that's what we're basing our study on, it better work. So we brought in the echocardiographers that were going to do the studies at the various sites. I picked two of our most difficult patients to study. And Bill and Joe would get these two patients and study them on Wednesday and Thursday, and then we would compare your results with the results on the 2 days in your intra-observer as well as intra-observer, and it came out that they were right on. The other question was, is lisinopril more effective than losartan, an ACE receptor blocker, angiotensin receptor blocker? So we took boys who hadn't been treated. We defined ejection fraction less than 55%, and the guys got a capsule. And I had no idea what's in the capsule, neither did the other investigators. It's either lisinopril or losartan. We did echoes every 4 months, so we had a sequence and timing that was standardized. We looked at safety parameters. If they got worse, we doubled the treatment at 5%. If they got less, if they dropped 10%, we kicked them off protocol and determined what they were taking and figured out. This allowed a comparison of the drugs to see if one of the drugs is superior to the other, and maybe this is the only study that'll answer it. So this is our protocol, essentially, what we did: consented, echo, physical exam, muscle testing, quality of life, labs, on and on. We got 23 patients over several years. I think it was 3 years. The Mecca came up with 2 patients, and there are the rest of the spread. We looked at the tech data, and as I said, it came out well. We had 22 boys enrolled, lisinopril 12, losartan 1. 2 were removed, each were on losartan 1 and allergic reaction, and 1 got a whole lot worse. Ages were similar, 12 and a half years versus 15 years, but there was no statistical difference. Granted, it's a small group. Baseline EFs were quite similar, and they significantly improved at the same level. They went from about 48 to about 55. And this shows lisinopril, this is losartan, and there was no difference between the groups. So one drug or the other should work. So we concluded no variation in results from the same tech on different children on different days, and different techs on the same child on different days. No difference in effectiveness of the drugs, equally safe and effective, and an open opportunity for treatment regimen on muscle function, which is another study. I'm going to skip this for purpose of time and carriers. Okay, aldosterone agonists. This is an emerging thing that you're going to start seeing literature on. It started out with an MRI study that was done by Dr. Hoare, who is now at Nationwide. He moved up from Cincinnati. And he, by looking on MRI at peak left ventricular myocardial circumferential strain versus controls, he found that it was abnormal in these guys, but they were only 8 years old. So is abnormal strain an early marker? Is that cardiomyopathy? Or is just having Duchenne cardiomyopathy? There's arguments about, we again have arbitrarily called the 55%. Here's a mouse study that was done at Ohio State, the Ohio State. They had this mouse model that was very similar to Duchenne. They were treated at 8 weeks or at 4 weeks or a control group untreated. They used MRI to look at fibrosis and strain. At the end, they took the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle and looked at them. And the treated mice with aldosterone did better, and the 4-week group did better than the 8-week group. So the skeletal muscle function paralleled the results in this. But was Steinbeck prophetic? Do the mice translate to humans? And that's a clinical study that needs to be done, actually is underway. Now, treatment of the primary disease. An exon skipping trial that Dr. Mendel did, and if anybody's eligible for a Nobel, this is the guy. Pay attention to what he's doing. Here again, we went through this. That's how you make dystrophin. But if you use gene therapy, you replace the defective gene. That's hard. Or you can suppress mutation. It only works in about 13% of Duchenne. So we now have to look at exon skipping. And following Sutton's law, Willie Sutton, the bank robber in the 20s, was asked why he robbed banks. And he said, that's where the money is. So you look at 80% of the population and it's exon skipping. Now, there are a couple of oligonucleotides that have been tried in this. This one's nephrotoxic. It was used in Holland. It's a more naturally occurring compound, but because of the kidney toxicity, it's been thrown out. And now we're using a morpholino oligomer that's more stable. It's taken up in higher efficiency in muscle. So again, looking at what happens, there's an out-of-frame splice, and you don't make dystrophin. But if you put this antisense oligonucleotide, it's called eplirsen, and it's now approved by the FDA, and your patients are getting it now. If they have an exon 50 deletion, what it does is knocks that out. Now look, we can get together. And what you make is a shorter messenger RNA and a novel dystrophin. Does this sound like Becker? Now, should these guys be transplanted? So here is the exon skipping trial at Nationwide, and it was done intravenously. They took 12 boys. Now, the courage of these boys cannot be understated. They agreed to muscle biopsies, whether they were placebo or treated, and these are serial muscle biopsies. My wife, having had a muscle biopsy, says never again. It hurts like stink, but these guys agreed to it. They were exon 50. They were ambulatory. It was a 2-year trial. They got IV infusion of either placebo, eplirsen at 50, or at 30 milligrams per kilo. Then the placebo group, 4 kids, were rolled over into an open label at either 30 or 50 after 24 weeks. They all had muscle biopsies before and at the end and at intervals. And they had echoes, which is where I came into the study. Results. Those getting 50 created 40% from the previous 0% dystrophin. Underscore. Those getting 30s made 40%. 6-minute walk test net benefit was 90 meters. They could walk further and better. None developed cardiomyopathy, but the mouse model of this work shows that the heart is not reached by this drug. Now they've hung a methyl group on it, and it may reach the heart by doing so. They went to the FDA. The head of the FDA quit over this because it was so much parental presence rattling the cage, but it did get approved. And it sets the stage for, since 80% of these boys, that's 1 exon, we only have 70 to go. So this is where I landed in the hierarchy, but started with bone marrow transplant and close to finish with this. The rest of it, those are bookends. Cardiac muscle continued to deteriorate in mice. Our job is to, Bill, we need to stabilize and improve the cardiomyopathy regardless of the skeletal muscle. And it raises the import of consideration of destination therapy or transplant. If these guys can be made into the Becker equivalent, we've got to shift our thinking. And this is just one of the LVADs. What if there were a cure for Duchenne? Raises the destination therapy concept. So concluding thoughts about the heart and muscular dystrophies. If you're following these patients, do a good history, physical, EKG, and echo at every visit. And many should, particularly the teens, get Holters. Some should have an MRI, but I haven't found that it makes any difference in what I do. And it's hard to have them lay with their scoliosis and their trouble breathing and on and on. You want to see the presence and extent of cardiac muscle conduction abnormalities. Serially evaluate them. If they got cardiomyopathy, I see them every 3 to 4 months. Consider evaluating carriers. I didn't hit this, but about a third of the known carriers, mothers and sisters, will have EKG abnormalities, and some have cardiomyopathy. I've got one little girl with horrible cardiomyopathy. She's a carrier. So we call that a manifesting Duchenne carrier. Is it fair to ask these boys to participate? In the end of the talk, I'm going to come back to that question. Academic integrity. Overenthusiasm on the part of some who lack honesty have led to a code of academic misconduct. There is one here at the University of South Dakota. I looked it up. There are 3 main components of academic misconduct that are the big no-nos. Fabricating, just making up data, falsifying data, taking your data and twisting it to fit, and plagiarism, which is the cesspool that we're immersed in PIR. John Darcy. Anybody heard of John Darcy? He was a resident at Emory. He went to Harvard and was Braunwald's favorite fellow. But he was making up data. He altered dates on his lab work. Few hours of work became several weeks of work. They took some of the hearts from the animals that he had radioisotope injected and found no radioisotope. And he was prolific with his publications and abstracts. American Heart Association in 1970, he set the record of something like 16 abstracts, none valid. Depth review 66 to 70, when he was a student at Notre Dame, he used false data there. This isn't a new thing that he was doing. Harvard retracted in 8330 of his papers. First time NIH asked for their money back from Braunwald's lab. So Emory said, well, he was here, let's look. They retracted 52 of his papers. So he's prolific. Braunwald got hoist on his own petard. He was severely criticized, both from the NIH and the New England Journal, for lax supervision, emphasis on productivity, publish, 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 but limited interaction. He did not go in the lab and see what the guy was doing. Now, Darcy just had no recall of the fraud. He apologized to the New England Journal, asking forgiveness for whatever I've done wrong. Excuse me. So then he leaves, he was left, and went to Schenectady and did an intensive care fellowship. And in 1984, the New York Board of Regents yanked his license. So now he's a medical record and a blogger under John Hughes Darcy, if you want to look up any of his stuff. Remember Bob Good, my hero, mentor, person in my residency that I respected the most? This is in his farm field, his favorite outfit, the bib overalls, and he was in his element here. He went from the U of M as a Regents professor to become president of the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research. He had been awarded the Lasker, which is a stepping stone to the Nobel. He trusted Bill Summerlin. I went to Bob and said, this guy's crazier than a bed bug. Several people warned him not to take this guy. What he did was he was taking guinea pigs that were black, taking skin and putting it on white guinea pigs. And to show migration of melanocytes, there would be a gray area on the edge of the perimeter of the black skin. And they had it. He proved that this graft took. Then somebody saw him using a black magic marker to do the gray stuff. This led to Bob being dismissed from Sloan Kettering. He went to the University of Oklahoma Research Foundation, then he became physician-in-chief in St. Pete. not necessarily an academic step up. And he died of esophageal cancer. There's a whole story there about trusting the wrong people. Anybody familiar with this geneticist? He became a monk to get free tuition. He studied under Christian Doppler of the Doppler principle. But a guy named Fisher, a century later, looked at his data and said, this can't be. The numbers are too good. Tried to duplicate it and couldn't. The monks, in the meantime, destroyed all of Mendel's records. And others disagree that this stuff's okay, but there's real question as to whether he fabricated his data. Okay, plagiarism. Now you're going to get a spectacular, superior, amazing grand rounds next week on this topic from Joe. But we're seeing an epidemic of this, and particularly in review papers where it's easy to cut and splice. But we use a tool called iAuthenticate, and he'll show you pictures of that color show where the stuff is taken. We've had papers up to 70% plagiarized. The author's contacted, and he or she could rebut. But if guilty, the paper is rejected by us, and we spend most of our time going through these and determining authenticity. All previous papers from Dr. Waltz then would be reviewed. And we use iAuthenticate there. And if the colors light up, those papers are retracted. Co-authors say, Bill wrote this with me as his supervising chief, and I didn't watch him do his work. I'm caught in that same web. And I can be barred from any of the AAP journals for a lifetime. Superiors can be notified. Call the dean, or write a registered letter to the dean, to the department head, and it sets up this whole internal investigation process. The dean gets the information. He contacts his investigation committee. The committee looks at all the where's and why fors, takes it back to the dean, and he makes a decision as to whether to fire the person. So after you've gone through the 26th grade, you pull this off, you can be fired. And it's tough to find a job. So don't think about doing this. Okay, you don't plan on cheating. The researchers, well, that world is open and you can do it. If I can, baby, you can. You ask a question, but propose an answer and look at a hypothesis and look at it prospectively. Mentors should not be assigned to you. You should choose your mentor, someone you can work with. And you might have a research mentor, you might have a career mentor, you might have a clinical mentor. So you can have several. But this is somebody that you talk to daily. All patients that you see are experiments in nature. Those that are going right now up to the clinic, the first patient they see can be somebody that can lead to a whole career of study. Do not accept dogma. In my opinion, doesn't count, but data do. Build the upside-down pyramid that I talked about earlier. Start with a concept and build on it. When I look back on the 50 years, it's been fun, and it still is. Now let's go back to the question, how do patients feel about this? My granddaughter, this is optimism. She thought she was knocking them clear out of the block, but you can see the fact that they weren't happening. Matty Stepanek had mitochondrial dystrophy. This is his book. He was born in 1990. He had 2 brothers and a sister who died of the same disorder. This is Matty. He was his biggest fan was Jimmy Carter at the time. This is Matty's, one of his last poems. So he would have been about 12, 13 when he wrote this. Kid wrote this. If I could, if they would. If they would find a cure when I'm a kid, I could ride a bike and sail on rollerblades, and I could have really long nature hikes. If they would find a cure when I'm a teen, I could earn my license and drive a car, and I could dance every dance at my senior prom. If they would find a cure when I'm a young adult, I could travel around the world and teach peace, and I could marry and have children of my own. If they would find a cure when I'm grown old, I could visit exotic places and appreciate culture And I would proudly share pictures of my grandchildren, which I'll do if you want. If they would find a cure when I'm alive, I could live each day without pain and machines. And I would celebrate the biggest thank you of life ever. If they would find a cure when I'm buried into heaven, I could still celebrate with my brothers and sister there, and I could be happy knowing that I was part of the effort. Are they willing to participate? He died in 2004.